I now look to Louisa Broeg, press officer, Wadham College, to close the case for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, I just want to say I'm very relieved that Melanie and me didn't trust the same mainstream media, because otherwise our speeches would have been very similar, and that would have been sad. But apart from that, moving on to the more serious part of my speech, I would like to thank the acting president, Sarah, for giving me the opportunity to speak in tonight's debate. The opposition has told you that good journalism is a prerequisite for democracy and an informed populace. The problem is that if we argue with the opposition tonight in saying that the mainstream media can be trusted, we ignore the structural issues that traditional journalism faces and the impact this has on the quality of the news that we read. I want to make it very clear that I'm not saying that the mainstream media has bad intentions. I'm saying it has structural issues that need addressing, and we need to be able to say that we don't trust the current media in order to address those structural issues. I'm going to bring you 3 arguments in my speech. Firstly, that the quality of the mainstream media has decreased as a result of increased competition and financial pressure. Secondly, that the mainstream media is not representative enough of the people. And thirdly, that even if we can resolve all of these structural issues, we should not vote for the opposition because we want to enfranchise those that feel left behind by the mainstream media. So on to my first argument of competition and financial pressure. Rupert Murdoch claims that Fox News does good journalism with the reasoning that it makes a lot of profit, and that's the excellence we should hold journalism up to. In this argument, I'm going to explain why this focus on profitability is extremely problematic, harms quality, and means that we should not trust the mainstream media. The purpose of many media companies has shifted towards being a profitable business rather than an objective source of information for the people. These two incentives used to be reconcilable, but the increased competition with non-traditional media outlets, things like podcasts or social media that are available for free on the internet, have put significant pressure on the mainstream media to cut costs in order to continue to be profitable. Many news companies have had to shift to advertise-based services because most people are not willing to pay for a subscription. Even though the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at this very institution, the University of Oxford, found that the willingness of Americans to pay for news almost doubled in 2017, it is still only at 16%. And decreasing sales of physical newspapers have only increased this problem. German contemporary philosopher Jürgen Habermas calls this the Rendite-Qualitätsdilemma, which is to say it's the trade-off between profit and quality that modern media needs to make. But let's assume media companies don't have that problem, or they receive some sort of government support like the BBC and other national broadcasting corporations. There's still a lot of pressure to cut costs because in a lot of these countries, we see there's less support for these institutions. For example, funding is often decreasing, and parties like the AfD in Germany promise to get rid of such payment systems altogether. This negatively affects the quality of the news stories that we read. Smaller, especially local newspapers, are disappearing because they're driven out of the market or bought by larger media moguls that publish the same content in different regions. The few companies that remain are more susceptible to lobbying groups and requests from advertisers to stay profitable. Secondly, let's look at the media companies trying to cut costs by reducing the number of correspondents they employ. This is bad for the quality of journalism. For example, when the horrible shooting in Christchurch took place earlier this year, there were only very few international correspondents in the country that could report on what was happening. The reduction of employees also affects the ability of newspapers to investigate local stories and hold the government accountable, like in the case of Grenfell. To still be able to report on issues from all around the world, more and more mainstream newspapers are buying stories from large press organizations or press agencies like Reuters and Associated Press. This is problematic because it means that news stories, especially from outside the United Kingdom, are increasingly at risk of fake news and misinformation, and there's little accountability. The financial pressure the mainstream media... Yes, please.
don't all the independent media, sort of the non-mainstream media, suffer all those problems but much worse?
The problem is that often these smaller corporations, the smaller media companies, don't need the same amount of financial resources because they don't have the same aim of broadcasting about all the different news that we want to know about, right? The problem is that companies like the BBC claim that they can give you all the news. The only way they can do that under the current financial pressure is by making sure that they cut costs and buy stories from press agencies. Now, let's look at the financial pressure and what this creates. I think this creates a vicious cycle where they cut costs by employing fewer correspondents, which then leads to worse quality, meaning that fewer people buy it so that they can employ even fewer correspondents. Why does this mean that we cannot trust the mainstream media? One, the quality of news it reports is decreasing as a direct result of cost cutting. And two, if we vote for opposition and argue that the mainstream media can nevertheless be trusted, we're far more likely to ignore the issues I've just raised, meaning that this is likely to get even worse in the long term. But let's move to my second argument about how cost-cutting creates a representation problem. Because even if we could somehow upkeep the quality of reporting, there's a second major problem that is associated with cost-cutting. The effect of reducing the number of journalists is unequally distributed. That is to say, the few good positions that are left often go to the most privileged. A 2016 City University study found that only 0.4% of UK journalists are Muslim and only 0.2% of them are black, compared to 5% and 3% in the general population. And who would have guessed 54% of senior print journalists in the UK attended Oxford or Cambridge, and 51% of them went to private school? This lack of representation decreases the quality of news because it makes it harder for journalism to capture the lived experiences and struggles of people. But let's, independently of that, look at my third argument of why we should vote in proposition to enfranchise those left behind by the mainstream media. Even if you think that all of these structural issues can somehow be solved or don't exist, I still don't think that you should be voting with the opposition tonight. And the reason for this is that you will send a signal for those who are saying, I can't trust the mainstream media. Simply telling them, but you can, is not enough, right? And it risks polarizing the society even more. These people feel disappointed by the mainstream media because of its systematic failings, like in the cases of Grenfell, where local media failed to investigate municipal mismanagement to prevent such a disaster from happening in the first place. In order to regain the trust of these people, it is not enough to argue that you can trust the mainstream media. Instead, the mainstream media has to be more representative of these people who feel left behind, the working class, women, religious and ethnic minorities. Some media outlets have tried to become more representative, for example, in the case of The Guardian, with its Everywhere But Westminster series. But this is not enough. They need to employ more journalists from underrepresented backgrounds, regardless of cost-cutting, and they need to change the backgrounds of the guests they invite. The Women's Media Center found that in 2019, only 37% of evening broadcasters in the US were done by women, and in 2017, 16.6% of journalists in the United States were people of color, compared to 37% nationwide. As long as these structural issues continue to exist, people will continue to feel left behind by the mainstream media because it does not represent the communities and the issues they care about. You should vote for proposition tonight because we are the side that acknowledges these problems. Voting for opposition only further disenfranchises the concerns of those who feel underprivileged. Before I end my speech, I want to acknowledge that it's impossible to speak in tonight's debate without acknowledging the incidents that took place at the Union this week. I want to stress that the discussion on the issue shouldn't be focused on individuals' people's choices, but rather on the wider structural issues this institution faces, i.e. the lack of diversity and on committee and within the union. I want to reiterate some of the points that Melanie has already told you. I believe this institution has an immense capacity to do good, to platform marginalized voices, and to make sure that students' voices are heard. But there are a few things that need to happen to make sure that that is done. Firstly, those on committee need to acknowledge their own privilege. Yes, I come from a state school background. Yes, I'm not from a traditional Oxford background and English isn't my first language, but I'm also white and I was born in a global north, so I have more privilege than other people who might apply for committee or want to be on committee. Secondly, we need to give more power to access roles, expand our access program to more people, and run more debating workshops, especially for those who are from non-Oxford backgrounds. I've seen many of my friends leave the union and resign from committee. The problem is that when we leave committee to a privileged few who can use their private school networks to win elections, these problems are not going to change. Please, if you think the union is not for me, run and change that or apply for committee. Look, the union will continue to exist as an institution on either side, but if you get involved, you can change the impact it has and the voices it chooses to platform. So please get involved and change this place. Thank you.